My grandmother used to say that the smallest lies were rarely spoken. Most of them were quietly hidden inside ordinary days until someone noticed the one detail that did not belong. I laughed every time she said it. After all, ordinary days were exactly what I loved most about my marriage. My name is Emily Carter. I am 36 years old, and for 11 years I believed I had married the most dependable man I had ever known. Daniel was not the kind of husband who surprised me with expensive gifts or dramatic romantic gestures. Instead, he remembered the little things that quietly held a life together. He replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors before they chirped. He filled my car with gasoline when he noticed the tank was nearly empty. Every Sunday morning, he made blueberry pancakes because he knew they reminded me of childhood breakfasts with my father. It was never exciting. It was simply steady. That was why I trusted him without effort. On a Thursday, everything changed. Seattle was wrapped in the kind of cold rain that blurred the windows and made the whole neighborhood seem softer than usual. Daniel had left before sunrise for what was supposed to be a 2-day technology conference in Chicago. He kissed my forehead, grabbed his suitcase, promised to call after landing, and hurried out the front door. It felt exactly like every other business trip he had ever taken. Around 5 that afternoon, while gathering laundry before starting dinner, I noticed his gray wool jacket hanging behind the pantry door. He almost never forgot anything. I smiled to myself, imagining him stepping into the chilly Chicago evening and realizing his favorite jacket was still at home. I slipped my hand into one pocket, expecting to find loose change or one of the peppermint candies he always carried. Instead, my fingers closed around something cold and unexpectedly heavy. It was a brass key attached to a blue plastic tag. Across the front, printed in simple white letters, were 2 words: "Welcome home." Beneath them, written in black marker, was a short code: 4B. I turned the key over several times before placing it on the kitchen island. At first, I barely thought about it. We had stayed in vacation rentals before. Perhaps it belonged to one of those trips. I even smiled while chopping onions, expecting Daniel to laugh when I asked why he still had it. Then, without warning, something felt wrong. I stopped cutting vegetables and leaned against the counter. Our last vacation rental had been almost 2 years earlier. It used a keypad instead of physical keys. The trip before that had been a beach cottage where the owner greeted us personally. Neither place had ever given us a brass key with a blue tag. I stood perfectly still. My mind searched through every trip we had taken during our marriage, but none of them matched what I was holding. The kitchen suddenly felt much quieter. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the pasta water began to boil behind me. I looked back at the key. It appeared almost new. The brass still shone. The plastic tag carried almost no scratches. Whoever had used it recently had not done so very long ago. I immediately hated the thought that entered my mind next. What if Daniel had been somewhere he never told me about? I pushed the idea away almost as quickly as it arrived. Suspicion had never existed between us. We shared everything: bank accounts, calendars, passwords, embarrassing memories, dreams we had never admitted to anyone else. If someone had asked me that morning whether my husband could keep a secret from me, I would have answered without hesitation: no. Yet the key remained on the counter, refusing to disappear simply because I wanted it to. I carried it into the living room, then back into the kitchen. I even laughed quietly at myself. One unexplained object did not erase 11 years of trust. There had to be an ordinary explanation. There always was. Still, every few minutes my eyes drifted back toward the blue tag as though it were silently asking me to notice something I had missed. By the time dinner was ready, I realized I had barely eaten anything all day. Finally, I reached for my phone and called Daniel. He answered after only 2 rings. Airport announcements echoed faintly behind his voice. "Hey, beautiful," he said cheerfully. "Looks like my flight is delayed." I smiled despite everything. His voice sounded exactly the same as always. Warm, relaxed, familiar. We talked about nothing important: the rain, my dinner, his presentation, a coffee shop he wanted to try near the hotel. I almost convinced myself the key no longer mattered. Then my eyes landed on it again. "You forgot your gray jacket," I said casually. He laughed. That explains why I've been freezing all afternoon. I picked up the brass key, feeling its unexpected weight settle into my palm. There was something inside one of the pockets. Really, he asked. What was it? I swallowed before answering. A brass key with a blue Airbnb tag. The cheerful background noise behind his voice suddenly seemed much louder. Daniel did not answer. Not immediately. It lasted only 2 or 3 seconds. But in 11 years of marriage, I had never heard silence from him quite like that. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. Too calm. Emily, are you sure it came from my jacket? For a moment, I thought the connection had frozen. Then I realized Daniel was waiting for my answer. Yes, I said quietly. It was in the inside pocket. I found it while looking for your gloves. Another pause followed. This one felt heavier than the first. That is strange, he finally said. I have never seen that key before. I listened carefully, searching for the smallest crack in his voice. Nothing sounded rehearsed. Nothing sounded defensive. If anything, he seemed genuinely confused. Are you sure? I asked. Emily, I would tell you if I knew what it was. He let out a slow breath. Can you describe it again? I looked down at the blue tag. Brass key. Blue plastic tag. It says welcome home. The number is 4B. No, he answered almost immediately. I honestly do not recognize it. His certainty should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me even more. Daniel had an extraordinary memory. He remembered hotel room numbers from vacations years earlier. He remembered where we parked at crowded stadiums. He once found my missing wedding ring because he remembered exactly which pocket I had reached into after grocery shopping 3 days before. Forgetting a key like this did not sound like him. Maybe it belongs to someone from work? I suggested, hoping he would agree. That is possible, he replied. There were a lot of people moving between conference rooms this week. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something deep inside me remained uneasy. Before hanging up, Daniel spoke gently. Please do not worry about it tonight. I will be home tomorrow evening. We will figure it out together. We said goodbye, but after the call ended, I continued holding the phone for several seconds. His words were reassuring. His silence had not been. I carried my dinner to the living room, switched on the television, and watched an entire episode without remembering a single scene. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted back toward the kitchen where the brass key rested beneath the warm light above the island. Around 10 that night, I finally admitted I was not going to sleep unless I stopped imagining impossible stories. I carried the key upstairs and placed it inside my jewelry box, almost as though putting it out of sight would also remove it from my thoughts. It did not. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I woke unexpectedly. The house felt unusually empty without Daniel beside me. I walked downstairs for a glass of water and noticed my phone glowing softly on the counter. A new message from Daniel had arrived only moments earlier. Love you. Sorry your evening ended with a mystery. We will laugh about this tomorrow. Reading those words almost brought tears to my eyes. They sounded exactly like the man I had married. Caring, gentle, certain that every problem could be solved together. I smiled for the first time in hours. Before returning upstairs, I opened the jewelry box one last time, intending to put the key back into Daniel's jacket, so neither of us would think about it again until he came home. As I lifted the blue tag, something brushed against my fingertips. A tiny white paper label had been folded tightly around the metal ring attaching the key to the tag. I had not noticed it before. Carefully unfolding the paper, I found only one line typed in small black letters. Check-in Friday. Check-out Sunday. The dates printed beneath the message were from 3 weeks earlier. Daniel had told me he spent that entire weekend attending meetings at his office in downtown Seattle. I stared at the tiny paper label until the numbers blurred together. 3 weeks earlier. Friday through Sunday. Those dates refused to leave my mind because I knew exactly where Daniel was supposed to have been that weekend. He had told me his company was preparing for an important software launch. He apologized for missing our usual Saturday breakfast, kissed me goodbye before sunrise, and promised we would make up for it the following weekend. I remembered spending those 2 days repainting our guest bedroom while listening to old jazz records. Every few hours, he had sent me short messages. Busy day. Running behind schedule. Love you. Looking forward to coming home. Nothing about those messages had seemed unusual at the time. Now every word returned with uncomfortable clarity. I carried the folded label upstairs instead of putting it back around the key. Sleep was impossible. By morning, I had convinced myself of two completely opposite ideas. Either there was a perfectly innocent explanation waiting to be discovered, or the life I believed I understood had quietly changed without me noticing. Neither possibility frightened me, as much as not knowing which one was true. I spent Friday morning answering work emails, but I caught myself rereading the same sentences again and again. Shortly before noon, my closest friend, Rachel Morgan, called to see whether I wanted lunch. Normally, I would have declined because I had deadlines to finish, but sitting alone with my thoughts felt even worse. Rachel immediately noticed something was wrong. "You look like you have not slept," she said after we ordered our coffee. I hesitated before taking the brass key from my purse and placing it on the table between us. She looked at it, then at me, waiting patiently. I told her everything. The forgotten jacket, Daniel's silence, the Airbnb tag, the hidden paper label with the dates. Rachel listened without interrupting. When I finished, she gently slid the key back toward me. "Do you think he is having an affair?" she asked quietly. The question landed harder than I expected. I looked out the cafe window before answering. I did not know what to think. Rachel nodded. "That is probably the most honest answer you can give yourself right now." She reached across the table and touched my hand. "Emily, one strange discovery does not erase 11 years. But pretending it does not matter will only make this harder." I sighed. "What would you do?" "I would wait until he comes home. Ask him every question you need to ask. Then listen carefully, not only to what he says, but to whether everything fits together." Her advice sounded sensible, yet my heart remained unsettled. As we stood to leave, Rachel looked back at me one last time. "Promise me one thing." "What?" "Do not become someone you would not recognize just because you are afraid of what you might find." I promised her I would not. At least, I believed I meant it. An hour later, I unlocked the front door, stepped into the quiet house, and saw Daniel's black leather overnight bag sitting exactly where he had left it before his last business trip. I froze in the hallway. I had never searched through my husband's belongings. Not once in 11 years. But for the first time since we married, I stood there wondering whether the answers I needed were already waiting inside that bag. I stood in the hallway for nearly a full minute, staring at the overnight bag. Every instinct told me to walk upstairs, make a cup of tea, and wait for Daniel to come home. That was what the woman I had always been would have done. She trusted first and questioned later. But another thought quietly pushed its way forward. If there truly was an innocent explanation, then nothing inside that bag could hurt our marriage. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I carried it to the dining table and unzipped the main compartment. The familiar scent of Daniel's cedar cologne drifted into the room. Inside were exactly the things I expected to find. A neatly folded dress shirt, a laptop charger wrapped with impossible precision, a paperback novel with a bookmark still resting halfway through the final chapter, a small travel toiletry bag. Everything reflected the man I knew. Organized, predictable, careful. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe fear had made me imagine a mystery where none existed. I zipped the main compartment closed, ready to put the bag back exactly where I'd found it. Then I noticed the small side pocket. It was slightly open, just enough for the corner of a folded receipt to peek through. I hesitated. Looking at it felt different somehow. I was no longer searching. I had already found something. With a quiet sigh, I pulled the receipt free. It came from a neighborhood grocery store in Bellevue. The date immediately caught my attention. 3 weeks earlier. The same weekend printed on the tiny paper label attached to the Airbnb key. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, as though my mind had become strangely calm. I read the list of purchases one by one. Fresh strawberries, artisan pasta, imported olive oil, sparkling mineral water, 2 crystal wine glasses. At the very bottom appeared a single line that made me stop breathing for a moment. Fresh white lilies. Daniel had never bought lilies. During our second year of marriage, I discovered I was severely allergic to them after receiving a bouquet from a coworker. Since then, he had carefully avoided bringing lilies into our home. He even reminded friends and family every spring. Forgetting something that important simply was not like him. I turned the receipt over, hoping to find another explanation scribbled on the back. Instead, a business card slipped onto the table. It belonged to a local dry cleaning shop only a few blocks from the grocery store. Written across the back in blue ink were 2 words. Thank you. There was no signature, no phone number, nothing else. I stared at the handwriting. It meant nothing to me, yet it felt strangely deliberate. Before I could think any further, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Hey, he said warmly. Good news. I caught an earlier flight. I should be home before dinner. I looked down at the grocery receipt still lying on the table. My fingers tightened around it without realizing. That is great, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Everything okay? He asked. I glanced toward the overnight bag, then at the brass key resting beside it. For the first time since we had met, I chose not to answer honestly. Everything is fine, I said softly. After we ended the call, I folded the receipt exactly the way I had found it and slipped it back into the side pocket. If Daniel truly had an explanation, I wanted to hear it before deciding what to believe. But deep inside, one unsettling realization had already taken root. I was no longer waiting for my husband to come home. I was waiting to discover whether the man walking through our front door would still be the one I thought I had married. Daniel arrived home just before 6 o'clock, carrying the same relaxed smile he wore after every business trip. The moment he stepped through the front door, he wrapped his arms around me and kissed my forehead. I missed you, he said. His voice was warm, familiar, and completely ordinary. For one dangerous second, I wanted to forget everything. I wanted to believe the key, the hidden label, and the grocery receipt were nothing more than strange coincidences that would disappear the moment he explained them. I missed you too, I replied, hoping he could not hear the uncertainty beneath my words. He wheeled his suitcase into the hallway and glanced toward the kitchen. Something smells amazing. Lasagna, I said. Your favorite. Now I know why I married you. He smiled, and I smiled back automatically. It felt effortless on the outside and painfully difficult on the inside. Dinner began the way it always had. Daniel told me about delayed flights, an exhausting presentation, and a client who accidentally spilled coffee across an entire conference table. Normally, I would have laughed. Tonight, I simply listened. Every ordinary sentence made the unanswered questions feel even heavier. When we finished eating, Daniel gathered both of our plates before I could stand. You cooked, he said. I clean. It was another one of our little traditions. Watching him rinse dishes beneath warm water, I wondered how someone could seem so completely like himself while carrying a secret large enough to shake my entire world. I reached into the kitchen drawer and quietly placed a brass key on the counter beside him. He noticed it immediately. The smile faded from his face. He turned off the faucet and dried his hands before picking it up. So this is what you found. I nodded. Daniel studied the blue tag for several seconds, turning it over slowly in his fingers. His expression was thoughtful rather than frightened. I wish I could tell you exactly where this came from, he said at last. But I honestly cannot. You have never seen it before? I asked. He looked directly into my eyes. Not that I remember. His choice of words caught my attention immediately. Not that you remember? He hesitated for the first time that evening. That sounded strange, didn't it? A little. He placed the key back on the counter. I've had the odd feeling all day that I am forgetting something important. Every time I try to think about the conference 3 weeks ago, everything feels blurred. Blurred. He nodded slowly, almost like trying to remember a dream after waking up. I folded my arms. Daniel, I found something else. He waited without speaking. I walked to the hallway, brought back his overnight bag, and removed the folded grocery receipt from the side pocket. His eyes immediately recognized it. Where did you find that? Inside your bag. He unfolded the receipt and frowned. I remember buying groceries. Relief flickered briefly inside me. Finally, something made sense. Who were the lilies for? I asked quietly. Daniel looked down at the last line on the receipt. His forehead creased with genuine confusion. Lilies. He read the receipt again from top to bottom. Emily, I never bought flowers. They are right there. He stared at the paper for another long moment before gently shaking his head. Something is wrong. What do you mean? He pointed to the jagged edge across the top of the receipt. Look carefully. I leaned closer. The receipt had been torn. The top section is missing, he continued. There should be payment information, the cashier number, and at least a few more items listed above these. He turned the paper over. This is only part of the original receipt. I remained silent. Ugh. Groceries make sense, he said slowly. Our office was assembling welcome baskets for visiting executives that weekend. I remember buying food and drinks with a coworker. He tapped the final line, mentioning the lilies. But I cannot explain this. He looked at me with complete honesty. Because I honestly do not remember seeing those flowers. Before I could respond, Daniel suddenly lifted one hand to his forehead. The color drained from his face. He closed his eyes tightly, as though a sharp pain had struck without warning. Daniel. I stepped toward him. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. It is happening again. What is? He opened his eyes slowly. They looked distant, almost unfocused. Every time I look at this key, I feel like I am about to remember something. He swallowed hard, and every time, it disappears before I can reach it. I guided Daniel to the living room before he lost his balance. He lowered himself onto the sofa, keeping one hand pressed against his forehead while breathing slowly through the pain. I had seen him suffer migraines only twice during our marriage, but this looked different. He was not sensitive to light or sound. He looked as though he were struggling to hold on to something slipping away inside his own mind. Should I call a doctor? I asked. He shook his head immediately. Give me a minute. I sat beside him without speaking. Nearly 5 minutes passed before the tension in his shoulders slowly eased. He opened his eyes and managed a weak smile. I'm sorry. Do not apologize. I scared you. Yes, I admitted. You did. He looked down at his hands. This has happened a few times over the last month. My heart skipped. What? Not this badly. Just brief headaches. I stared at him. You never told me. Because they lasted less than a minute. He sighed. I blamed stress. And now? He glanced toward the brass key still resting on the kitchen counter. Now I'm not so sure. I walked into the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, and returned. Daniel drank half the glass before speaking again. Emily, there is something I need to ask you. Anything. Do you trust me? The question hung quietly between us. A week earlier I would have answered without thinking. Now I search for the most honest response I could give. I trust the man I have known for 11 years, I said softly. I just do not understand what is happening to him. Daniel lowered his eyes. Neither do I. We remained silent until his phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen displayed a familiar name. Mark Sullivan. Daniel answered immediately and placed the call on speaker. Hey, Mark, you made it home? Mark asked. About an hour ago. Good. Mark hesitated before continuing. Listen, there is something strange I wanted to ask you. Daniel looked at me. Go ahead. Do you remember the leadership conference 3 weeks ago? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not very clearly. That is what I was afraid of. My attention sharpened instantly. Daniel sat up a little straighter. What? Another pause followed. Because you asked me the exact same question yesterday. Daniel frowned. Yesterday, you called while waiting at the airport. Mark sounded puzzled. You kept asking what happened after we finished shopping for the welcome baskets. Daniel slowly shook his head. I do not remember making that call. I thought you were joking. Mark gave a nervous laugh that quickly faded. You asked whether we stopped anywhere before going back to the office. Did we? Daniel asked quietly. Yes. Mark answered without hesitation. One of the executives left his laptop at an Airbnb our company had rented for visiting staff. We drove there before heading back. My heartbeat quickened. Daniel glanced at the brass key. Do you remember the address? Not exactly. Mark paused. But I remember the apartment number. Neither Daniel nor I spoke. It was 4B. The room became perfectly still. Daniel slowly looked toward me. Neither of us had mentioned the number on the key to Mark. There was no reason he should know it. Mark, Daniel said carefully, did I go inside that apartment? No, are you sure? Positive. Then who did? I did. Mark's answer came immediately. You stayed outside because you were talking to an older woman. Daniel frowned. What older woman? Silence. Then Mark answered in a quieter voice. That is the strange part. He hesitated before continuing. I never saw her arrive. Daniel remained silent for several seconds after the call ended. He was still staring at his phone, but I could tell he was no longer seeing it. His thoughts were somewhere else, trying to piece together fragments that refused to fit. Finally, he looked at me. I never told Mark about the key. I know, I replied quietly, which means he remembered the apartment number on his own. Daniel nodded. And somehow it matches the tag I found on my jacket. Neither of us liked how naturally those pieces connected. They answered one question while creating several new ones. Daniel stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen. He picked up the brass key again, turning it over between his fingers as though expecting it to reveal something different this time. Instead, another sharp pain crossed his face. He gripped the edge of the counter until it passed. It is happening again, he whispered. What do you see? I asked. He closed his eyes. Not enough. Anything is enough. He remained perfectly still for nearly half a minute. A parking lot. His voice was barely above a whisper. Zen. He swallowed. Someone is calling my name. Boo. I cannot see her face. His breathing became uneven. She is holding something. He slowly opened his eyes and looked down at the key in his hand. This. Before I could respond, the memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Daniel exhaled heavily and rubbed both temples. It is gone. I guided him back to the dining table. Maybe you should see a neurologist. I will, he replied. But first I need to understand why all of this leads back to that apartment. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Mark. Asterisk, I found the expense report from that weekend. There is something you should see. Asterisk, seconds later a photograph arrived. Daniel enlarged it immediately. It showed a reimbursement form submitted by several employees after the leadership conference. Most of the purchases matched the grocery receipt I had found. Strawberries, pasta, olive oil, mineral water, wine glasses, but one line near the bottom stood out. Emergency locksmith service, Unit 4B. Daniel frowned. A locksmith. I thought the apartment already had a key. Apparently something happened to the lock. He zoomed in further. Beneath the reimbursement items was a handwritten note signed by the company's finance department. Replacement key issued directly to D. Carter. We both looked at the brass key lying on the table. So the key was officially given to you, I said. Daniel slowly nodded, which means I was wrong. I didn't know this key. You just do not remember receiving it. He leaned back in his chair, trying to process the discovery. Emily, if the paperwork says I received the replacement key, why would I tell you I had never seen it before? The answer was obvious, yet neither of us wanted to say it aloud, because he genuinely had no memory of receiving it. Before we could continue, Daniel's phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number from Seattle. He answered cautiously. This is Daniel Carter. A calm female voice spoke without introduction. Mr. Carter, my name is Hannah Brooks. I am a detective who investigated the incident outside Unit 4B 3 weeks ago. Daniel's expression froze. I think it is time we finally talked. Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at me, then switched the call to speaker. You said you're the detective who investigated Unit 4B? I was, the woman replied. Her voice was calm, measured, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years choosing every word carefully. My name is Hannah Brooks. I retired from the Seattle Police Department 6 months ago. Daniel frowned. How did you get my number? It was listed in the original case file. Why are you calling now? A brief silence followed. Because I learned this morning that you have the key again. My pulse quickened. Daniel glanced toward the brass key lying on the dining table. Who told you that? Nobody. Then how do you know? Because someone contacted me asking whether I had ever recovered it. The room fell silent. Hannah continued before either of us could interrupt. Mr. Carter, I've spent 3 weeks hoping. Nobody would find that key. Now that you have it, the situation has changed. Daniel leaned forward. I think you should start at the beginning. I agree, she answered. 3 weeks ago, officers responded to a medical emergency outside a grocery store in Bellevue. An older woman had collapsed in the parking lot. Daniel slowly nodded. Mark mentioned something about that. The woman refused to identify herself beyond giving the name Margaret Ellis. We later confirmed it was false. Hannah paused. While paramedics were treating her, she insisted on speaking only with one person. Me? Daniel asked. Yes. His forehead tightened. I do not remember meeting her. That is exactly what I expected you to say. Daniel exchanged a puzzled look with me. What? Hannah answered carefully. Because you told me the following day that large portions of the previous evening had completely disappeared from your memory. Daniel's face lost color. I spoke to you. At the hospital. I have no memory of being there. According to the emergency physician, you suffered a mild concussion. I looked at Daniel in surprise. You hit your head? He shook his head slowly. I do not remember that either. Hannah continued. The injury itself was not serious. What concerned the doctors was the temporary memory loss surrounding the incident. Daniel rubbed his forehead. So the missing memories are real. Yes. Hannah's voice softened slightly. We believed they would return naturally within a few days. They never did. I know. Daniel remained silent for several moments before asking the question that had been growing between us since this nightmare began. What happened outside that Airbnb? Hannah exhaled quietly. Mr. Carter, before I answer that, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Is your wife with you? Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. She has been beside me through all of this. Good, Hannah replied. She needs to hear everything. I felt my heartbeat quicken again. Hannah continued. The woman you met outside Unit 4B was terrified. Not confused. Not delusional. Terrified. She believed someone had been following her for weeks. Daniel listened without moving. When she saw you, Hannah said, she walked directly toward you as though she had been looking for you. That makes no sense, Daniel whispered. I had never met her. That is what you believed. Hannah's words hung in the silence. She called you by your full name before you ever introduced yourself. Neither of us spoke. She handed you the brass key, Hannah continued, and asked you to keep it safe no matter what happened. Daniel stared at the key lying on the table. Did she tell me what it opened? No, then why would I agree? Hannah paused. Because after giving you the key, she said something that changed your expression immediately. Daniel swallowed. What did she say? Hannah answered slowly, as though repeating words she had never forgotten. She looked directly into your eyes and said, your father kept his promise. Now, it is your turn. Daniel closed his eyes. For the briefest moment, his breathing stopped. Then he whispered 3 words that sent a chill through the entire room. I have heard that voice. Daniel's words lingered in the room long after he spoke them. I have heard that voice. He looked as surprised by the confession as I was. His breathing became shallow, and his eyes drifted toward the window as though he were trying to focus on something far beyond our house. Hannah remained silent on the phone, allowing the memory to find its own way back. I cannot see her face, Daniel whispered, but I know her voice. Do not force it, Hannah said gently. Memory rarely returns because we demand it. It usually returns because something finally fits. Daniel closed his eyes again. I remember rain. He pressed 2 fingers against his temple. An umbrella. Another pause. Someone telling me not to look behind me. His eyes opened suddenly. Then nothing. The fragments vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Hannah spoke again. That is more than you remembered yesterday. Daniel nodded, slowly, even though she could not see him. Tell me everything you witnessed. After the woman gave you the key, the 2 of you spoke for nearly 5 minutes. I could not hear the conversation because I was interviewing witnesses on the opposite side of the parking lot. When I walked toward you, she suddenly stopped talking. She looked directly at me, smiled politely, and said she needed to leave before it was too late. Did she? Daniel asked. No. Hannah's voice became quieter. She took only a few steps before collapsing. I leaned forward instinctively. From the concussion? No. She appeared physically exhausted, but conscious. The ambulance took both of you to the hospital because you had fallen and struck the back of your head while trying to catch her. Daniel frowned. I fell. According to 2 witnesses, yes. She fainted unexpectedly. You reached out to stop her from hitting the pavement, lost your balance, and struck your head on the curb. Daniel looked at me. That explains the concussion. Yes, Hannah replied. but it does not explain the woman. Daniel remained silent. At the hospital, Hannah continued. She refused to answer almost every question we asked. She would only repeat one sentence. What sentence? Daniel asked. Hannah took a slow breath. If he forgets, do not make him remember too soon. A chill ran through me. Why would she say that? Hannah answered honestly. I did not understand it then. And now? Daniel asked. Now I think she knew exactly what a concussion might do to your memory. Daniel lowered his head, which means she expected me to forget. That is what has troubled me from the beginning, Hannah replied. She behaved as though losing those memories was part of a plan she had already prepared for. None of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in my mind since the call began. What happened to her after the hospital? Hannah sighed. She disappeared. Daniel looked up immediately. Disappeared. She was admitted for observation shortly before midnight. A nurse checked on her less than an hour later. Hannah paused. The room was empty. She walked out. Apparently. Security cameras? That is the strange part. Hannah's voice became noticeably more serious. The hallway cameras recorded every nurse, every doctor, every visitor entering or leaving that floor all night. And Daniel asked. She never appeared on any of them. Silence filled the room. Are you saying she vanished? Daniel asked carefully. No, Hannah answered. I'm saying we never found a recording showing how she left. She continued before either of us could speak. Her hospital gown was folded neatly on the bed. Every personal belonging she arrived with was gone except one. What was left behind? Daniel asked. A sealed envelope. Daniel instinctively glanced toward the brass key. Was my name on it? Yes, Hannah replied. Across the front, in blue ink, were 7 words. She paused before repeating them slowly. For Daniel Carter. Only after he remembers. Daniel slowly lowered the phone from his ear after the call ended. Neither of us spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt heavy, as though our house had quietly filled with questions neither of us knew how to answer. After nearly a minute, Daniel looked toward the brass key resting on the dining table. She left a letter for me. Yes, I said softly, but she wanted you to read it only after you remembered. He nodded, which means she believed my memory would come back. Before either of us could say anything else, Daniel's phone vibrated again. It was a text message from Hannah Brooks. There was no greeting, only an address and one sentence. If you want the envelope, meet me tomorrow at 10. Come together. Tell no one. Daniel read it twice before placing the phone face down on the table. Do you think we should trust her? He asked. I considered the question carefully. I did not know if we should trust her. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. But I do know she has never asked us to believe her without evidence. Daniel gave a slow nod. That is true. The rest of the evening passed quietly. We tried watching television, but neither of us followed the story. We made tea, yet both mugs grew cold before either of us finished them. Around midnight, Daniel stood by the living room window, looking out at the rain. Emily. Yes. I keep feeling like I am forgetting someone important. I walked over beside him. Not something. He shook his head. Someone. His eyes remained fixed on the dark street outside. Every time I hear Hannah repeat that woman's words, I get the same feeling. What feeling? Like I promised someone I would come back. He frowned, frustrated with himself. But I cannot remember who. I rested my head lightly against his shoulder. Maybe tomorrow will help. He smiled faintly. You are always the optimistic one. One of us has to be. The next morning we left early for the address Hannah had sent. It led us to a quiet cafe overlooking Elliott Bay. The morning crowd had not yet arrived. Hannah was already seated near the window with a leather briefcase resting beside her chair. She stood as we approached. Thank you for coming. Daniel sat across from her. You said you have the envelope. Hannah nodded, but did not remove it immediately. Instead, she studied Daniel carefully. Before I give you anything, I need to ask one question. Go ahead. Since yesterday, have you remembered anything new? Daniel hesitated. Only fragments. Tell me. Zen. A parking lot. An umbrella. A woman's voice telling me not to look behind me. Hannah remained completely still. Then she quietly asked, anything else? Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. There is one image I cannot explain. What is it? A lighthouse. Hannah's expression changed instantly. For the first time since we met her, she looked genuinely surprised. You remember the lighthouse? Daniel slowly opened his eyes. I do not know why. Hannah leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. Then your memory is returning faster than I expected. She unlocked the briefcase and carefully removed a large sealed evidence envelope. Across the front, written in elegant blue handwriting, were the words Hannah had described. For Daniel Carter. Only after he remembers. Daniel stared at his own name without touching the envelope. This has been waiting for 3 weeks? Hannah nodded. Actually, much longer than that. Daniel looked up. What do you mean? Hannah slid a second document across the table. It was a property record from the Airbnb apartment. The woman checked into Unit 4B under a false name 3 days before you met her. Daniel glanced over the paperwork. Why does that matter? Hannah pointed to the registration form. Because according to the building manager, she spent those 3 days asking only one question. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. What question? Hannah looked directly into his eyes before answering. She wanted to know when Daniel Carter would finally come back. Daniel read the property record 3 times before setting it back on the table. The words refused to make sense. She was waiting for me, he asked quietly. Hannah nodded. According to the building manager, she arrived on Tuesday afternoon. Every morning, she came downstairs and asked whether anyone named Daniel Carter had checked in. Every evening, she asked the same question before returning to her apartment. I looked at Daniel. She knew you were coming. He slowly shook his head. But I did not know her. Hannah folded her hands together. That is what I believed at first. Then I began reviewing older records. She reached into the briefcase again and removed a thin manila folder. Everything changed after I searched your father's name. Daniel's expression tightened immediately. My father, Richard Carter. Hannah slid an old newspaper clipping across the table. The paper had yellowed with age, but one photograph remained surprisingly clear. It showed a volunteer group cleaning driftwood along the shoreline near Point No Point Lighthouse nearly 20 years earlier. Daniel immediately recognized the smiling man standing near the center. Dad, Hannah nodded. Look at the woman beside him. Daniel leaned closer. Standing only a few feet away from his father was the same older woman from the grocery store. She looked younger, but there was no doubt it was her. They knew each other, Daniel whispered. For years, Hannah replied. I found their names together in community volunteer records, charity events, and local preservation projects dating back almost 2 decades. My heartbeat quickened. Why would Daniel never know about her? Hannah answered honestly. I do not know. Daniel continued staring at the photograph. Dad never mentioned her. Not once. Hannah opened the folder to another document. Your father also visited Unit 4B 2 days before he died. Daniel looked up so suddenly that his coffee nearly tipped over. That is impossible. The apartment building's visitor log says otherwise. She pushed the photocopy toward him. There, in neat handwriting, appeared Richard Carter's signature beside the date. Daniel's father had entered the building at 3:18 in the afternoon. He left 52 minutes later. He never told me, Daniel murmured. According to your family doctor, Hannah continued carefully, your father passed away from heart failure less than 48 hours later. Daniel remained completely silent. I reached for his hand beneath the table. His fingers felt cold. Did he meet the woman there? He asked. Hannah slowly nodded. The building manager remembered seeing them together in the lobby. Did anyone hear what they talked about? No. Hannah paused before adding. But the manager remembered something else. Daniel lifted his eyes. What? When your father left, he looked back toward the elevator and said one sentence. She glanced down at her notes before reading aloud. If he ever comes back, tell him I kept my promise. Daniel closed his eyes. His breathing grew uneven again, but this time no headache came. Instead, a different expression crossed his face. Sadness. Deep, unexpected sadness. I have heard those words before, he whispered. Hannah remained quiet. Not from you, Daniel continued. From Dad. He pressed his fingertips against his forehead. The night before he died, Another fragment surfaced. He could almost see his father sitting in the old wooden chair on the back porch, watching the sunset in complete silence before speaking those exact words. At the time, Daniel had assumed they referred to nothing more than an old family memory. Now, they carried an entirely different meaning. Hannah gently pushed the sealed envelope toward him. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I believe your father spent the last years of his life waiting for this moment." Daniel looked down at the envelope, but still did not open it. "There is one thing I do not understand." "What is that?" Hannah asked. "If my father and that woman trusted me enough to leave all of this behind." He looked from the envelope to the brass key resting beside it. "Why did neither of them ever tell me the truth while they still had the chance?" Daniel's question remained unanswered for several moments. Hannah looked down at the sealed envelope before speaking. "I asked myself that same question for weeks." She gently rested one hand on the table. "Then I realized I'd been asking the wrong one." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "Instead of asking why they never told you, I should have asked what they believed they were protecting you from." Daniel leaned back quietly. The words settled somewhere deep inside him. "My father was never secretive," he said. "He believed the truth always came out eventually." Hannah nodded. "Exactly. Which is why I do not think he was hiding the truth from you. I think he was waiting until it became safe." Daniel looked down at the brass key. "Safe from what?" Hannah slowly shook her head. "That is the one answer I never found." She pushed the envelope another inch across the table. "Perhaps it is inside." Daniel placed both hands around the envelope, but still hesitated. His fingers rested on the seal without breaking it. "I keep feeling that if I open this now, something in my life will never be the same again." I reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "Maybe that is exactly why she wanted you to wait until you were ready." He looked at me for a long moment before giving a small nod. Carefully, he broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of cream-colored paper. The handwriting matched the elegant blue script on the outside. Daniel unfolded it slowly. "Read it," Hannah said softly. His voice trembled only slightly as he began. "Daniel, if you are reading this, then I was unable to tell you everything myself. That is not your fault. It simply means time chose differently than I hoped." He paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "You have spent your life believing our first meeting happened outside a grocery store. It did not. You were 16 years old the first time we spoke." Daniel stopped reading. His eyes widened. 16. The number echoed through his mind. Another memory flickered just beyond reach. A rocky shoreline. The sound of waves. His father's laughter carried by the wind. He continued reading. "Your father brought you to Point No Point Lighthouse because I asked him to. He trusted you more than he realized, even then." Daniel's breathing became uneven again. Images flashed through his mind too quickly to hold. A white lighthouse, an old wooden bench, a silver cross hanging around an elderly woman's neck. "Emily," he whispered without looking up. "I remember the bench." Hannah remained completely silent. Daniel continued reading. "That afternoon I asked you to promise me something. I asked you that if one day a stranger ever placed a brass key in your hand and told you your father had kept his promise, you would not throw the key away, no matter how little sense it made." Daniel lowered the paper. His hands had begun to shake. "I made that promise." He did not say it as a question. He knew it. The certainty in his voice startled even him. More memories surfaced. A younger version of himself sitting beside the woman overlooking the water. His father standing a few yards away, giving them privacy. The woman smiling kindly before placing the brass key into his teenage hand. "You are a good listener," she had said. "One day that will matter more than you can imagine." The memory disappeared almost immediately, but this time it left something behind. Not confusion, recognition. Daniel looked back at the letter and read the final paragraph aloud. "If your memory ever leaves you, trust your heart before your fear. Your father believed you would always become the kind of man who protects people even before knowing their story." He was right. Daniel quietly folded the letter. Tears filled his eyes, but he did not wipe them away. "She knew exactly who my father was," he whispered. Hannah nodded. "Yes." Daniel stared at the table for a long moment before asking the one question that had suddenly become more important than every mystery surrounding the key. Did my father ever tell you why he trusted her? Hannah's expression softened. No. She reached into her briefcase one last time and removed a small black and white photograph. But I believe this might help. Daniel accepted it carefully. The picture showed 3 people standing in front of Point No Point Lighthouse nearly 20 years earlier. His father stood on one side. The older woman stood on the other. Between them was a teenage boy smiling awkwardly at the camera. Daniel recognized himself instantly. Then his eyes moved to the back of the photograph. In his father's familiar handwriting were 7 simple words. Family is sometimes chosen before it is understood. Daniel turned the photograph over several times, running his thumb gently across the faded edges. It was not simply an old picture anymore. It was proof that an entire chapter of his life had quietly existed beyond the reach of his memory. He looked at his 16-year-old self, standing between his father and Margaret. They were all smiling naturally, not like strangers posing together, but like people sharing an ordinary afternoon. I remember taking this picture, he whispered suddenly. Hannah looked up. You do? Daniel nodded slowly. Not everything. Just one moment. He closed his eyes. Dad joked that I looked too serious. Margaret laughed and told me that one day I would appreciate photographs because memories could not always be trusted. His voice cracked slightly. I laughed because I thought she was being dramatic. He opened his eyes again. She was trying to warn me. Hannah remained silent, allowing the memory to settle. What happened after the photograph? I asked gently. Daniel frowned. I cannot reach that part. Hannah carefully gathered the documents on the table before removing one final folder from the bottom of her briefcase. Unlike the others, this one was noticeably worn, its corners softened by time. This never became part of the official investigation, she said. I found it among your father's personal effects after his estate attorney contacted me. Daniel looked surprised. My father's attorney knew you? Only because your father left instructions. Hannah slid the folder toward him. He asked that if anyone ever reopened the case involving Margaret, this folder should be given to the detective in charge. Daniel slowly opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page and a small cassette tape sealed in a plastic sleeve. The sight of the cassette immediately caught him off guard. Dad kept this. Hannah nodded. According to the note, he recorded it the week before he died. Daniel unfolded the handwritten page. It contained only a few lines. If Daniel has come this far, he deserves to hear my own voice instead of reading someone else's version of the truth. Emily, if you are standing beside him, thank you. Please remind my son that love is measured by what we choose to protect, not by what we choose to possess. Daniel quietly lowered the note. Hearing my name written years before we had even met no longer felt impossible. Somehow it felt deeply like Richard Carter. He had always believed people entered our lives long before we realized why. Hannah looked toward the cassette. I had it digitized to preserve it. She removed a small digital audio recorder from her bag and inserted a memory card. I have never listened beyond confirming the recording worked. I believed it belonged to Daniel. She pressed play and placed the recorder gently on the table. For a few seconds, there was only the soft hiss of an old recording. Then another voice filled the quiet cafe. Older, calm, warm. Richard Carter. Son, if you're listening to this, then life has unfolded in a way I hoped it never would. Daniel's eyes filled instantly with tears. It had been 6 years since he had heard his father's voice. There are some promises a man keeps because he is asked to, others he keeps because breaking them would change the person he sees in the mirror. Margaret carried a burden that never truly belonged to her. I carried a small part of it because nobody should have to protect hope alone. Richard paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. If your memory has failed you, do not be ashamed. Memory is only one way the heart remembers. Kindness survives in ways facts never can. Daniel lowered his head, listening without moving. I never told you everything because I wanted you to build your own life without looking over your shoulder. You deserved a future that belonged to you, not to my unfinished responsibilities. If today has finally arrived, it means that future is safe. The recording stopped for a brief moment before Richard spoke one final sentence, quieter than the rest. There's only one thing left for you to do. Go back to the lighthouse one last time. She left something there that belongs only to you. The recording ended. No music, no footwood, only silence. Daniel slowly wiped his eyes. The lighthouse, he whispered. Hannah gave a small nod. I think that is where your father always believed this story would end. Just then Daniel's phone vibrated. A new message had arrived from an unknown number. There was no text, only a recently taken photograph. It showed the weathered bench beside Point Lighthouse. Resting on the seat was a small wooden box. Underneath the image appeared 6 simple words. It is finally time to remember. The drive to Point Lighthouse began before sunrise. Neither Daniel nor I spoke very much. The wooden box waiting on the old bench had occupied every thought since the mysterious photograph arrived the previous evening. Hannah followed in her own car a short distance behind us, carrying the remaining documents from the investigation. As the first lights spread across Puget Sound, the white lighthouse slowly appeared through the morning mist. Daniel pulled into the nearly empty parking lot and switched off the engine. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he reached for my hand. Whatever happens today, he said quietly, thank you for staying. I smiled through tears. There was never anywhere else I wanted to be. We walked together toward the weathered wooden bench overlooking the water. Just as the photograph had shown, a small cedar box rested neatly in the center of the seat. No look, no note, only Daniel's name carved carefully into the lid. He looked around the shoreline. There was no one else there. The waves rolled gently onto the rocks, and gulls circled quietly overhead. It felt less like the beginning of another mystery, and more like the peaceful ending of a very long journey. Daniel lifted the lid. Inside rested 3 simple objects. The brass Airbnb key, a silver cross identical to the one Margaret had worn around her neck, and a sealed envelope addressed simply to the man who kept his promise. Daniel opened the envelope with steady hands. The handwriting was instantly familiar. It belonged to Margaret. He began reading aloud. Dear Daniel, if this letter has reached you, then everything happened exactly as your father and I hoped it would. That may sound strange after everything you have endured, but please believe me. The greatest success of this story is not that you remembered. It is that you were allowed to live most of your life without needing to. Daniel paused for a moment before continuing. There was never hidden money. There was never a secret organization. There was never a forgotten fortune waiting behind the key. There was only a frightened child who deserved the chance to grow up without fear. Your father helped make that possible. So did many ordinary people whose names history will never remember. They asked for nothing in return except silence until the danger had passed. Tears quietly filled Daniel's eyes. The brass key never mattered because of the apartment it opened. It mattered because it reminded me that promises are sometimes carried by objects until the people who made them are finally ready to let them go. He looked at the key resting inside the box before reading the final paragraph. Please do not spend another day searching for me. I have lived a long and peaceful life because good people chose kindness over recognition. Honor your father by doing the same. Love your wife well. Build a family that knows honesty without fear. And when you one day tell your own children about the best man you ever knew, tell them he was their grandfather. Daniel folded the letter slowly. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to solve. No final conspiracy waiting behind another door. No hidden villain preparing one last surprise. Only the quiet truth that one decent man had spent his life protecting a promise because another decent woman had once trusted him to do so. Hannah stepped forward and gently placed the investigation folder inside the cedar box before closing the lid. This case ends today, she said softly. Exactly as it should. Daniel looked toward the lighthouse, then out across the water where the morning sun now shimmered across the surface of Puget Sound. For the first time since finding the key inside his forgotten jacket, the uncertainty had disappeared from his face. In its place was something quieter. Gratitude. He slipped the brass key into my hand instead of his own. "I think we should leave it here," he said. "Its job is finished." Together we placed the key back inside the cedar box beside Margaret's letter and the silver cross. Hannah arranged for the box to be donated to the local historical society with the personal names sealed from public access for another generation, exactly as Margaret had requested. Some stories deserved to be remembered. Others deserved to remain acts of quiet kindness known only to the people whose lives they had changed. As Daniel and I walked back toward the car, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders just as he had done countless times before. Nothing about the gesture was dramatic, yet it somehow carried the weight of everything we had survived together. I finally understood what my grandmother had tried to teach me all those years ago. The smallest lies are rarely spoken, but neither are the greatest acts of love. They live quietly inside ordinary days, hidden in simple promises, patient hearts, and people who choose to do the right thing even when nobody will ever know. Long before I found an Airbnb key in my husband's jacket, I believed I had married a good man. The truth was even more beautiful than I could have imagined. I had married the son of one.